Now that we've explored together the 11 therapeutic factors, it's time for us to turn our attention to how to set up a group. So we're going to look first at group leadership and what you can do to help the group run effectively. I'm going to talk first about a very important figure in counseling, Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers developed or identified core conditions by which change and growth within a client could occur if they were present, if they had been established. His 3 core conditions were as follows: genuineness or congruence, being yourself, being honest, being direct with a client. The second was accurate empathic understanding, knowing what a client is going through and demonstrating to a client that you understand what they're going through to the extent you can. The third factor was unconditional positive regard, that regardless of a client's behavior, you accept them as a person, you value them as a person, you prize them as a person, as Rogers would say. These conditions, I think, very applicable to group. If they are present, it establishes the group atmosphere for growth to occur. So as the group leader, it's really kind of impingent upon you to think carefully about who you are with clients and with group members. So what other characteristics do effective group leaders have besides this presence that I referred to? Well, first I'm going to talk to you about awareness and observation skills. And to my mind, one of the core reasons for you to engage in mindfulness practice as a counselor, apart from your own, of course, wellness, is to become more sensitive to how other people are in the room with you, to be paying attention closely to them, and to be taking in multiple sources of information at the same time. One of the things I struggled with the most as a counselor was I would hear clients and listen to all this content coming at me and attend to it, while at the same time having to ask myself questions like, why are they telling me this? Why now? Why does this matter? Why are they telling me this specifically? And so there were kind of 2 processes going on in my own head, and it felt like a lot to manage at once. The more you're able to do that, and it comes with practice, your brain kind of expands, you become more able to do it just through practicing counseling, the better able you are to help a client, to dig deeper, to get beneath what a client is telling you. That is particularly, I would say, important and challenging to group work, because you're listening to content coming at you from different group members, and you're also paying attention to the process between members. So that becomes a challenge and something that, again, you have to work on over time. Don't expect yourself to be an expert at that right away. It is going to feel overwhelming, and you will feel exhausted at the end of the day when you're learning to be a counselor. That's just the way it goes. Next, I'm going to talk about courage. I think as a counselor, you need to be courageous and take risks with a client and to be honest with them in a soft way, in a way that's caring. But at the same time, shying away from important issues is not therapeutic, and it will actually detract from the therapy, particularly in group work, where if you aren't bringing up these underlying kind of, I would say, irritations, hostilities, they're going to fester and they're going to really undermine the group process. Humor, I think, is very important as well. I think we bind to people who we laugh with, and so being able to be humorous is important. I think you, as the group leader, need to have belief in the group process. Believing in the group process will rub off on the group members, and if you don't believe in the group process, neither will your group members. Last, I'm going to mention comfort with silence. As a counselor in general, being comfortable with silence is important because it allows the client space to explore their experience, to think through issues, and to be more self-directed, and not that you basically solve problems for them and ask them questions and prompt them all the time. It's important for them to sit with silence and to be able to choose what to say next. And in the group, the silence is one of your best friends, most useful tactics, especially in long-term outpatient groups, because when you use silence, the members facilitate the work, the members take it on. And the power of a process group is when the members take action and the members own it. They own the work of the group. And I'll add here that obviously there are limitations to this. You can't use a lot of silence in briefer therapy groups such as psychoeducational groups, where the focus is on imparting information and training in skills. That requires more activity from the group counselor. Let's move on. I'm going to talk about styles of group leadership. There are three main styles: authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire or passive. Authoritarian is when the group leader takes charge. They have hard and fast rules that everyone has to follow. They are kind of quite rigid, unbending on those rules. They always start, they always close the meeting. They will interrupt, jump in, and they often, I would say, they have like 50% of the time they are talking. Now, there are sometimes some groups where that's appropriate, such as psychoeducational groups. You do need to have kind of a strong presenter in those groups, in some groups. But I think in other groups, such as more process groups, it becomes a major problem because the members become dependent on the leader. And if the leader isn't present for a meeting, the group either doesn't meet or it really flounders when it meets without the leader. We're going to talk about laissez-faire, the other kind of side to that spectrum. So a passive leader also creates problems from being too inactive, because the group will flounder without direction. Groups don't know the best way to be at first. They don't know what's expected. And often there's a lot of ambiguity at the beginning, and you need to be a little bit more active on the front end of helping members understand the basic norms around group behavior, such as giving feedback to each other, engaging the here and now. Those things matter. So a democratic leader is a leader who's active when they need to be, who facilitates process among and between members, but who doesn't jump in all the time and allows the process to happen. And to the extent possible, even in psychoeducational groups, gives opportunities for members to give feedback and to get actively involved in the process. So for example, helping to plan the group or giving kind of the summary at the end of group. If another member could do that, it's better. All right, I'm going to talk about norm setting next. It's important for me to mention here that norms, group norms, are kind of these unwritten rules, right? And when they are in place, they are difficult to change. Okay, so you want to interrupt the process early to establish good norms. Oftentimes, norms are hard to interrupt without turnover. I'll give you a really classic example of a problematic norm, where one member responds, shares a story, and then the next member shares a story, and there's no interaction among members. They just each person takes a turn telling a story. If you interrupt that process too late after a couple of sessions, the group members think that, hey, a group means I get to come here, listen to other people's stories, and wait for my turn. And that is not an effective use of group process. So you need to interrupt that early and get members talking to each other and giving opinions and things like that. Giving feedback. Now, I'm going to talk next about norms and how it relates to your leadership. When you respond to a member, you establish a norm. Meaning, if let's say if one member talks and another member talks and you only respond to the first member and not to the second, you're telling the group implicitly the first member is more important than the second. If there are topics in group that you're nodding about and others that you're not nodding about, group members will notice that, and they'll again attribute more importance to certain things. So everything you do as a leader, you have to scrutinize for yourself and be aware that you are establishing strong norms because of your role as the leader. Now, if you're an overly concealed leader, you don't share much of yourself, you can expect that the group will reflect that. You'll create a norm of caution and guardedness, okay? And if you're an overly open leader, you tell too much of your own personal details, you can expect that the foil would be the group will rely on you and become more interested in you, and that you'll be expected to do that week over week, and it will turn the focus upon the leader. And so I think that's problematic as well. What we want to do is, again, for the group to become autonomous, for group members to take responsibility. So when a group member asks you a direct question, don't always respond to that. Try your best to deflect that question to the group and have the group answer it, have the group give their take on it. That facilitates group process, and it becomes a norm that instead of just asking the leader for everything, I can ask other group members. Okay? I think one of the other things you can do, particularly in more outpatient groups, is you can highlight successful group meetings or even moments in group and compare and contrast to that, again, to help explain and educate around what a successful group looks like. Okay, so I'm going to move now onto the skills of a leader. I realize this is a fairly lengthy lecture, so hang in there with me, but we're covering a lot of important information here. I'm going to talk next about linking, cutting off, drawing out, diverting, and rounds. Those are major techniques you have at your disposal as a group leader. Linking is about when you have two members who are experiencing something similar or even very different, and you can compare and contrast. And let's say Joe one week talks about an experience that Mary had talked about the week prior, something very similar. You would link and say, Joe, I'm wondering if this relates to what Mary was saying last week, or if you've been thinking about what Mary's experienced, because it sounds quite similar to me. Cutting off is when you have a group member who is, I would say, more active in the group to the extent that they're monopolizing. They are talking over other people, they talk for the majority of group time, and they do that consistently over and over the course of numerous sessions. You can't let that go on for very long, otherwise the group becomes demoralized and bored and agitated and irritable. Instead, you have to cut that person off, and then you have to find ways to integrate them more effectively. So directly asking the group member who's monopolizing to say, is it possible for you to step back for a moment to observe the next 20 minutes, and then I'll ask you in a few minutes to share your impressions of what just happened and to ask group members questions. That does two things. Number one, it gives space to the other group members. Number two, what it also does is that it helps establish the importance of feedback in the here and now with other group members. Because without this, group members are going to be kind of, lost and frustrated and feeling like they don't have much input. And that the monopolizing group member will then start learning what matters in group, right? And that'll start bleeding out to the other group members, because they also will start giving more here and now feedback, because you've kind of set that norm. That's what's expected. Drawing out is next. Often you'll have quiet or silent group members even, and you want to include them in the group process. And the way that you do that is through asking about observations. So Janie, I noticed that you've been very quiet for the last 30 minutes of group, and I'm wondering what thoughts you've had about what we've discussed so far. Or I noticed you nodding when Carol was talking. Can you share more about what you were thinking and feeling then? So you're bringing in the group member and also highlighting the here and now. Diverting is the next technique. That's when you have two members who are at odds, who are at conflict. If that goes on too long, it will take up the entire group, and you don't want the other members to just be sitting there watching conflict. Eventually, you're going to want to bring the group into it, and you do that through diversion. So you ask the group, what are your thoughts on what's just occurred between, John and Margaret? Can you explain to us your thoughts there? And share with John and Margaret any thoughts you have. The last technique is one that's kind of quick and dirty. It's called rounds. Rounds is when you're really stuck and the group is totally silent and it's a new group. You would ask the group to kind of go around and share something brief about themselves. Okay, kind of like an icebreaker. You don't want to rely on rounds, especially in an outpatient group, a long-term group, because it does not facilitate member-to-member interaction. It instead just facilitates us being kind of individual parts of this whole. And so with rounds, you just have to use it carefully and do not rely on it too much. Okay, so I'm going to talk next about one of the other key things you can do as a group leader. I'm going to talk about contracting. Sometimes you'll have group members manifest some of the problematic behavior that they're in counseling for in the first place. And when that happens, it's important to get a contract from that person, that when that shows up again in group, that it can be addressed and talked through. So let's say that Jimmy has this issue with maybe demeaning people who he sees as weak, okay? If maybe the next week you see this again and Jimmy starts kind of maybe just dismissing a group member who's crying or who seems quite emotional, you could say to Jimmy something like, Jimmy, I think this actually relates to the reason you're in group in the first place. I'm wondering if you would be open to getting feedback from other group members about this when it occurs, because I think it'll be useful to you. So when I notice you kind of dismissing other group members when they seem weaker, would it be okay if we just say, Jimmy, you're doing this again, let's look at this, and getting them. And so once you get the group members' agreement, then you can start working through that issue with them. I'm going to close out this very long video lecture, hopefully it was helpful to you, by talking about co-leadership. In larger groups, you often have or need a co-leader, and it's very important that you're working collaboratively, not competitively with each other, because competition will breed competition within the group and undo conflict. What you want is for you and the co-leader to be working in concert with each other, because that models cohesion. And that concludes our video lecture on how to set up a group and the importance of group leadership in that process.